Thank you, Tiffany, and good morning, everybody. The first session this morning to kick the forum off is entitled "The Drugs Don't Work." We know that antimicrobial resistance is a hugely complex and high-profile problem with implications for people, animals, and indeed the environment across the world. And issues that AMR touches on range from the need to safeguard health and welfare to consideration of many economic impacts. There are lots of strategies, both within the UK with the Antimicrobial Resistance 5-year strategy, which started in 2013. In Europe, there's an AMR action plan published in 2011. We know that the legislation has been looked at in Europe and indeed across the globe with the CARB initiative in America, the WHO initiatives, FAO, OIE, they all have a plan. And the common high-level aims within these plans are aimed to not just reduce the total volume, but to improve our knowledge and understanding of AMR through research and surveillance, conserving the effectiveness of the antimicrobials that we currently have through good stewardship, optimal use, targeted use, and responsible use, and stimulating the development of new antibiotics in the pipeline, as well as looking at rapid point-of-care diagnostics and novel therapies and strategies which will all aim to reduce antibiotic use. We have three speakers who will present, and then, as Tiffany's already said, we'll have the opportunity to ask questions from the floor. So the first speaker, it gives me great pleasure to introduce, is Kitty Healey, who is Head of AMR at the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, and is going to give us a view from those who've got a really difficult and often unenviable task of managing antimicrobial resistance strategy. Okay, Kitty, thank you.
Well, thanks very much, and it's brilliant to be here today to talk to you about AMR strategy. I'm the head of the VMD's antimicrobial resistance team. I'm a vet. I've been at the VMD since 2009. And before I start talking about AMR, I'd like just to tell you a little bit about the VMD. Not all of you may be completely familiar with it. What we do, in essence, is to look after making sure that veterinary medicines in the UK are safe, that they work, and that what you buy is what it says it is and does what it says it does on the packaging. So this means that a lot of the work of the VMD is actually around authorising, in other words, licensing veterinary medicines. And this isn't just before they're authorised, it's also monitoring them after they're authorised. Things like pharmacovigilance, looking at adverse reactions and looking for medicines residues in food. But on the other side of the VMD, we're responsible for making, updating and enforcing the veterinary medicines legislation in the UK, the national legislation. And we also are responsible for advising government ministers on the policy on this side of things. And the AMR team is based in the policy side, so that's where we sit. Now, I thought for my next slide, it's always worth just taking stock and being absolutely clear what we're talking about. So we define antimicrobial resistance as when microorganisms survive or grow when exposed to an antimicrobial product at a concentration that we would normally expect would kill them or inhibit their growth. Now, I've put up the definition for antimicrobial resistance because AMR is in the title of my talk, but actually what I'm going to be talking about today and what we're focusing on is antibiotic resistance, so specifically bacteria and not other microorganisms. So AMR is a high-profile area, we know that. This is a selection of some of the headlines that have appeared in the past, and we can see AMR being compared with things like terrorism. We can see it being described in terms of a pandemic, and we can see words like threat and that kind of language being used. And that does raise the profile of AMR. And it's not necessarily wrong to emphasise the risks of AMR, but I think that headlines like this may have been part of the background for a recent editorial in the Vet Record a couple of weeks ago that raised concerns about this kind of profile drowning out the actual good actions that are going on, the responsible stewardship. And that's not necessarily a good thing. But as John touched on it's not just the health risks that we're looking at with AMR. Obviously, it is the health risks, but these do have an economic impact, and there's been increasing focus on that recently. The report that I've got up there is from part of the Jim O'Neill review, which is an independent review. And now I can't picture what up to $100 trillion worth of economic output lost would be, but it clearly is a good financial motivation to invest in addressing AMR. So, well, what about animals? A lot of what I've talked about so far focuses on humans, human health, economics, and sometimes there's a risk that animals get left behind in all of this or get mentioned in the wrong light. We are all people, so we do all have a vested interest in making sure that the drugs that are going to be given to us and our friends and family work, but we also need to look after this for animals. And so in the rest of the talk, I'm going to be looking through some of the strategy documents that John mentioned in his overview, and I'm going to be trying to pull out the bits of them that are related to animal health. So we'll start with the UK. In the UK, we have the 5-year antimicrobial resistance strategy. The overarching goal of the strategy is to slow the development and spread of AMR. And this is articulated in 3 strategic aims, which I've actually put up there on the slide so that you can see them. The strategy itself goes into more detail, and it's available on the gov.uk website, so it's readily accessible for everybody. But the other thing to really highlight with the UK strategy is it does take a One Health approach. You can see these strategic aims are not divided into human and veterinary. They apply across the board. And a couple of the things that we're doing at the moment with, for example, in improving the knowledge and understanding of AMR, in DEFRA we've got a modest R&D budget, and we also operate surveillance systems for antimicrobial resistance and antimicrobial sales. With conservation and stewardship, we have recently updated some guidance and published new guidance on, firstly, the responsible use of medicines on farms and on using antibiotics responsibly under the cascade. When it comes to the stimulation of development of new antibiotics, the veterinary sector is a bit of a poor relation on this, but certainly diagnostics, rapid diagnostics and novel therapies are areas of focus. And one thing that doesn't quite come through in the 3 strategic aims, but which is a common thread running through the strategy, is the need for communication and outreach and listening to what everybody has to say and gathering that all together. The EU, I know this is the UK strategy, but the EU has a European Antibiotic Awareness Day, which I expect lots of you are already aware of. It's on the 18th of November every year. And Public Health England have a campaign, the Antibiotic Guardian campaign, which tries to bring everybody together from across the different sectors, general public as well as professionals, and register their support for protecting antibiotics. And finally, before I move on, I mentioned Public Health England, reflecting that it's a One Health strategy. The lead departments are Public Health England, Department of Health and DEFRA. So moving on to the EU. This is the EU's action plan. It has 12 actions. Now this is split into some human actions, some veterinary actions and some joint. And 5 of the actions are specifically veterinary related. I've got them up here for you, so regulatory framework, prudent use, animal health law, new antibiotics and surveillance systems. But I'm going to really focus on 2 of these where there's been specific work going on or where I think that there are useful things to draw out. The first of them is going to be regulatory framework, and then I'm going to talk about the last one there, the strengthening of surveillance systems. Okay, so the regulatory framework. This really refers to the veterinary medicines legislation and the medicated feeding stuffs legislation. And these have been revised, and there is the revised draft which is published on the Commission's website, and it's available, again, if you want to have a look at it. And there are a few proposals in here. These are not agreed yet. They're still undergoing the technical read-through in Brussels. But there are a few aspects which are different, significantly different from what we have at the moment on antibiotics. So starting off with the veterinary medicines legislation, it's quite upfront in its preambles that it's aiming in particular to do several things, but one of those is to address the public health risk of AMR. One of the ways that it's hoping to do this is through licensing of veterinary antibiotics. And there are a couple of things in here which are new. For example, antimicrobial resistance, the risks of this to humans and to animals are going to be considered in the benefit risk assessment. Now, the benefit risk assessment is the part of the evaluation of dossiers that determines whether or not it's acceptable to authorise it. And risk mitigation measures, again, the legislation is calling for the companies who submit the dossiers to describe risk mitigation measures that may be necessary to continue the favourable benefit risk evaluation. And these could be things like warnings on the labels, or they could be things perhaps as strong as studies after the product's authorised to monitor how it goes. On the note of availability and the problem with what's called the pipeline of new antibiotics, additional data protection is envisaged. Now, data protection refers to the period of time that a pioneer, a brand new antibiotic in this instance, holds the market before generics can be made of it. And for this, what's envisaged is 14 years instead of 10 years for everything else. Only time will tell whether that is actually sufficient incentive to make a difference. Now, prescribing. There's actually, with prescribing, although there was some concern that prescribing and dispensing would be decoupled, that hasn't materialised in the proposals. And in fact, although there are explicit recommendations for prescribing of antibiotics, in reality, I don't think it changes very much what we currently do in the UK. So it's limited to qualified prescribers, and that's defined nationally. So in the UK, that would be vets. And vets would be able to dispense antibiotics, but to animals under their care and in the amount required for the treatment concerned. So as I say, I don't think that really changes much. On the cascade, there is a statement in there that provides for the Commission to restrict use of certain antibiotics on the cascade if there is a risk to public health. Now, it's not articulated in any more detail than that. It's a provision for that to be the case should it be necessary. And there is also a wider restriction that's potentially there should it be necessary for antibiotics of particular importance to human health. But it is quite clear in the proposed legislation that the risk to public health will be balanced with the risk to animals of not having the antibiotics and to the farming industry as well, and to the implications that that might have. So on medicated feed, there are actually a few recommendations or proposals in the medicated feed draft legislation that are quite specific and are not, there's not a counterpart in the veterinary medicines legislation. But, for example, there are tighter restrictions on carryover of the active substance between batches of medicated feed. On prescribing, we're looking at a maximum quantity prescribed, requirement to examine animals. There's also a note in there saying that use of medicated feed for prevention and growth promotion are not permitted. Growth promotion obviously has been banned in the EU since 2006. And also a limit on the prescription life. Those are the main things I wanted to pick out from the legislation. And I'm going to move on now to the second thing that I wanted to talk about with the EU action plan, and that's about the strengthened surveillance systems. Now, currently in the UK, in terms of antibiotic use, we have access to sales data. So we've got total sales data from pharmaceutical companies which show their sales of antibiotics, not the sales at the level of prescribing, it's the sales by the pharmaceutical companies. And that has several limitations. It means that because in some products several species are indicated on the labels, it means that we can't tell what proportion of antibiotics went to one species and what went to the other. And even for products where they're only authorised for one species, we can't tell whether all of the antibiotic went to that species or whether some of it was used on the cascade and how much. So it makes targeting areas for improvement very difficult. And so the screenshot I've got up here is it's a page of the European Medicines Agency, and it's the page for the SVAC project, the European Surveillance of Veterinary Antimicrobial Consumption. Now, SVAC are working on, they publish sales data and reports on trends in the EU, but only a few member states have the capacity to measure antibiotic consumption in animals. And so the purpose of what this group is doing at the moment is really trying to develop and build and strengthen that kind of surveillance in member states. And recently that's been manifested through developing a protocol for on-farm recording of veterinary medicines use at a really quite a detailed level. And that's been piloted in a number of member states, including the UK. And to put that into context, this is a little map that shows, I talked about surveillance being one of the things that we do, and this is a map, just a simple map showing what surveillance we do and how all of this fits in. And so you can see that in the grand scheme of things, we have the sales data. We don't have consumption data clearly in the UK, and a lot of our efforts at the moment are working towards getting that consumption data. I'm not going to dwell on that because I want to get in a little bit about what's going on more widely internationally. And so I've got this slide up because this is a nice picture of the world map without any borders shown, because we always talk about bacteria as not respecting borders. But really all you need to do is to imagine a map of international flight plans or international trade routes. And it's really easy to see that if you only concentrate on a national or even a regional plan, you're going to fail. And there are too many things going on, there are too many organisational and national things going on to mention everything. So I'm just going to briefly touch on three. The World Health Organization, I want to just mention that at the World Health Assembly last month, the WHO Global Action Plan for Antimicrobial Resistance was adopted, and that's a really, really good news story. It means that right from the top, you've got a direction, everybody's signed up to not only the fact that we need to act, but also what we need to do, and it's a commitment to do that. So that helps to avoid duplication, and it's a really big thing in getting momentum going. The OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health, have been doing a lot of work on AMR for a considerable period of time, and I think what I really want to draw out in this is their role in international harmonization of surveillance, which they're working on. And then the FAO, the main thing I want to say here is that actually this week is the FAO conference, and a resolution on AMR supporting the World Health Organization Action Plan is tabled. And so my last slide, it is a global issue, but it's also our issue. It's something that we can all make a difference with. And I've put in here, you can limit resistance through your actions and be seen to be doing so. Now, that's not a cynical statement. The reason I put the antibiotic guardian up there is that I think more people actually sign up. This is a place where we can actually register that we're doing something that we're interested in and we can be counted. So that's what I want to finish on.
Thank you, Kitty. That was very enlightening, a lot of work going on there. But it's important that we hear from veterinary surgeons who are working in different sort of sectors within the profession on how they actually perceive and how we can actually do this sort of in practice. So the first of those presentations is going to be from Guy Carter. The biography is within the programme, so I'm not intending to read it out, and we'll try and keep to time. So, Guy, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name's Guy Carter. I'm a senior partner in Medivet, which is a large small animal partnership. And my topic today is to discuss what the Medivet AMR response is. So what I want to touch on is what are we doing about antimicrobial resistance? How have we implemented the strategies? What has been useful for us? What are the difficulties we encounter with this? And then I'll end up with an example of one of our clinical audits. So if we start with looking at the UK AMR strategy, which is a 5-year plan that Kitty told us about, developed by DEFRA and the Department of Health. We've looked at that strategy and we've taken out of that what applies to us in small animal clinical practice, what can we do about it? And the 3 aspects that we've identified are improving infection prevention and control practices, optimizing prescribing practice, and improving education, which leads to improved clinical practice and understanding. So we've had a look at how we can incorporate these strategies into our SOPs and our protocols. And for example, I can give 3 prophylactic antibiotic use. I can remember the days when we used to give a shot of Clamalay for any spays or neuters that we were doing. And glad to say that those days are long gone. Likewise, prophylactic antibiotic use with orthopedic operations. We'll use perioperative intravenous antibiotics, but then we won't carry on with a course of antibiotics after the operation. There's MRSA swabbing. It's not just MRSA, it's also for other opportunistic bacteria. So in our busy hospitals, we'll be swabbing once a month, various surfaces. In the quieter clinics, we do it every 3 months. There's a report obtained on that. And if you are picking up any problems there, then you can review your practices of hygiene in that clinic and the different strategies that you have in the clinic for that. And then another example would be Protect, which is a very useful poster that was given to us by the BSAVA, and that gives the vets an indication of which antibiotics they can use for different types of infections and what would be your first-line antibiotics of choice. They do give you a few antibiotics to choose from, and we've customized that so that our vets have got clear guidance of the antibiotics that we have on our shelves, what they can use for different conditions. So we've incorporated the AMR strategies into our protocols. What do we do now about getting this information out to all of our vets? Medivet's got over 110 clinics. We've got 270 vets and over 1,000 staff. Your first inclination would be to publish your protocols on your intranet, which is what we do. Email the group. We've got, as I said, over 1,000 people on our books, so we email all of our people, and then it's job done. And unfortunately, that's a typical picture of me at my desk every morning, because emails just don't cut it. So there has to be a different way that you can get this information out to all your people on the ground that they can actually have buy-in. And we need to change the culture and the way of thinking. So how we do that is by using a structured and integrated approach. We need our staff to have buy-in, and they've got to be motivated by the protocols that we're advising on. And then we need to monitor our progress with this. So we've set up a clinical governance policy, pretty much taken from what, guidance from the practice standard scheme, because they give very good layout of what's required. So we have clinical meetings. These happen typically in each branch. You aim to have them once a month. But it's not just having the meetings, it's how you carry the meeting out and what conclusions you draw from those. Significant events are also reported at these meetings. Then there's communication of information, which is obtained at CPD meetings. Clinical audit, and practice policies and protocols. Clinical audit is quite difficult, and I'll give you an example of a clinical audit at the end of the talk, just to show you how that works. So what do we find helps us in practice? First of all, I'd say the practice standard scheme, because as I said, in determining that clinical governance, that's been invaluable. The Royal College has just come out with a clinical audit toolkit, also very useful because as vets in practice, I think we lag a bit behind our medical counterparts, and most of us don't know how to carry out a clinical audit. There's the BSAVA guidelines, which help us in making up our policies, things like the Protect poster, and then certificates. I mentioned certificates because I find that that's invaluable at the coalface. If you've got our vets who've gone on certificates, the information they get in general clinical terms, but also with regards to AMR, gets filtered through to the rest of the team. So I'm all for our vets doing certificates. So what do we find doesn't help? Well, there's the changes to basic principles. People like myself, when we came out of university, we were taught very clearly that when you start an antibiotic, you have to finish the course. Nowadays, we use perioperative antibiotics, and you don't carry on further than that. Trying to get that culture to change is really difficult because it was ingrained in your initial training. There's pressure from owners, not only because they've got preconceived ideas about when antibiotics should or shouldn't be used, but they also want results, and they want results fast. Then you can look at inappropriate antimicrobial use, and this is trying to get that change in culture. Very often our vets will want to give antibiotics to any animal that's got a fever, and it's saying, look at the differentials. There may be inflammation causing a fever, and it might not be infection. Diarrhea, we have protocols now where we try not to use antibiotics in diarrhea unless it's a particularly severe bloody diarrhea. We won't be using antibiotics as a first port of call. And I can remember not long ago when Sinulox or something of that nature was reached for whenever there was a diarrhea. More things that don't help. There tends to be quite a variation in style of practice. So you try and change all your protocols, but there are still many vets who don't base their treatment on evidence. So I'm forever trying to train our vets to do, for example, ear smears every time they're going to treat a case of otitis externa and not just reach for the shotgun treatment. And that brings me on to lack of narrow spectrum formulations, because it's all very well looking at your ear smears, trying to determine if there's cocci or rods or if there's malassezia, but then you're still coming down to an ear preparation that's pretty much broad spectrum in terms of a shotgun cover, one eardrop covers all. Most importantly would be time. Vets are all busy in practice, and to have time to actually attend these meetings is really difficult, and I'll show you an example of that. So what I've done to finish with is to show you, this is a real-life clinical audit that we had in our Watford region. We've got 15 clinics in our Watford region, and they feed into a 24-hour hospital. So for this particular audit, we asked all the vets to attend from those 15 clinics. They had to, as their homework, pull out cases of cats that were under 10 years of age, which had been treated for cystitis in the preceding year. And we asked them each to present at least 10 cases per clinic. We kept a record of who attended, and these were the cystitis audit results. What's interesting to see there, I highlighted in C and F. In fact, before I get to that, first of all, if you look, there's only seven people who, or clinics that attended, and that, I think, comes back to the time constraints that one has. So out of 15 clinics, you may have found one or two were off sick. You would have found some who couldn't attend because they would have been presented with an emergency at 7 o'clock that they had to go to the hospital to sort out, so they weren't able to attend the meeting. And someone might have been too tired, for example, because maybe they'd been working 10 days in a row because they'd done the weekend shift. So this makes it difficult to create these meetings. And these meetings aren't optional. If you have a meeting, then it's part of the practice standard scheme, but that's how many people we've got attending. Then if you look at C and F, these people did the cultures, but regardless of whether they had a positive or negative culture, they were still using the antibiotics. And so this is trying to change the way that people are thinking. The audit discussion. This was a discussion held by the vets at the end of this meeting. All vets agreed that there is a component of subjective interpretation when evaluating the presence of bacteria on in-house smears. There was unanimous agreement on the incorrect use of antibiotics. I don't like this part, from vets of older generations. But also inappropriate use of prescribed treatments by owners. And then this was probably input from someone who had done a certificate. In cases where indwelling urinary catheters had to be placed as part of necessary treatment, the use of antibiotics is not recommended. And so This will all then be put onto our intranet so that everyone can access the findings. But also, this is enabling those vets who attended to have buy-in to what we're doing, because they were part of the process of determining that protocol. And the post-audit protocol that came out of this, every animal should be getting a full physical examination when they come in with cystitis. We want to try and obtain a urine sample for urine analysis, start them on pain relief, NSAIDs. If you see bacteria on your smear, then you can start an appropriate antibiotic treatment and send a sample off for culture. And you would then want to amend that antibiotic as appropriate, depending on the results of your culture. And that's a picture of my dog Wallace, because I had a big audience and I wanted to share that with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy. That was quite insightful, how the standard operating procedures have been developed within your practice. We'll move on across the species now to hear from Matt Dobbs on what his view is on the large animal sector. Matt.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to the Foundation for asking me to come and speak. Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, if there's any challenge or upset caused in the audience for any of my slides, it was entirely purposeful. Let's see if we can get a bit of a debate going later on. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do in practice and maybe put a few challenges out to members of the audience about how we might be approaching this problem in the future. Okay, first couple of slides to tell you a little bit about our market. The UK livestock veterinary market is estimated to be worth somewhere between 400 and 450 million pounds and growing significantly. Actually, when you look at the market globally, it's growing much quicker than that, driven by the protein debates, which is where developing nations are increasing their diet in terms of protein consumption at a great rate. And I believe that as a profession here in the UK, as a more mature profession, we have a lot to offer the developing world when it comes to livestock veterinary care. On average, medicine sales probably account for about 70% of an average livestock practice revenues, and antibiotics probably account for about half of those. So as you can see, we've got a growing market here, of which antibiotics are a very, very important tool in the armoury of any practising vet. Dare I say it, no more important nowadays than a laptop computer or that rectal glove, but certainly a very, very important tool in the way we enact our job. And the service to the livestock sector in the UK is undertaken by a number of different veterinary practices. There are about 120 veterinary practices badging themselves up of only dealing with farm animal species, but less than 20 practices now with more than one full-time equivalent in the pig and the poultry sector. But there still are over 1,300 practices where livestock-focused work accounts for somewhere between 20 and 70% of those revenues. So it's very, very important when we're talking about antimicrobial resistance issues that we make sure we address the whole of the profession and not those that are just purporting to be spending most of their time looking at livestock. There are a number of vets out there that are having more sporadic contact with livestock species and with producers. And we are seeing a changing market, and the market will continue to change. Somebody told me once that the number of dairy farmers exiting our industry has been the same since about 1915, in the fact that we've lost somewhere in the region of 2 to 3 dairy producers every week over that period of time. But obviously we notice it more now. We're getting a smaller industry, probably less than 10,000 active registered dairy producers in the UK now. But actually the total milk volume that we're producing in the UK hasn't changed. So therefore what we're seeing is larger herd sizes and more production coming from the same number of animals. That's obviously going to be leading to production stresses, and so we need to factor that in when we're talking about how we approach the health of these animals. UK government certainly understands that for us to be able to feed the population in the future, we need intensive agriculture, and a sustainable approach to that is important. What we also need to be aware of is that if we accelerate the growth of our livestock production systems with limiting capital investment, then we will see significant health challenges. And while those can be addressed by pharmaceutical intervention, what we really should be doing is making sure that the systems in place are sufficient to keep our animals healthy in the first place. And I do believe that we're really on a cusp here in the livestock sector where precision agriculture is going to really help the livestock sector. I've noticed my friends in farming in the arable sector over the last 10 to 15 years really engaging with technology, and you can't jump on a combine or a tractor these days without a whole number of instruments bleeping at you and telling you everything about the ground underneath which you're driving. And I think the application of technology into the livestock sector will really help us to understand that sector in a much better way. Dare I say it, when we get 5G, which is anticipated to start in 2020, yes, I know I can't even get 3G at home at the moment, but 5G is coming in 2020, and that will really allow us to remotely monitor animals with sensors and devices that can come straight through to our smartphone, allowing us to make much more evidence-based decisions when we're treating animals. So communication and language is important. Let's talk about antimicrobials. What have we got here? What can you see? A cow in what? Anybody know what this is? Robotic milker, somebody said? Yes, robotic milker. You tell the average consumer that's a robot interacting with an animal, they might not be very happy. And actually, if you went to the US, they'd call that a voluntary milking system, where a cow can go and choose to be milked whenever she wants. You'll be pleased to know this is not a UK slide, this is a US slide. So we've got cows here, electric wire over the top of them so they don't mount each other in whatever they're lying. What would we call this system in the UK? Type of housing system. A cubicle system, some people might call it. Kennels, somebody else might call it. In the US, they call that a freestall. The cow is free to go and choose to lie wherever she wants to lie. So when we talk about our scientific endeavours, it's very, very important when those messages are further going to be communicated to the general public. We're very careful about the language that we use. Because we do, as a vet, as a practising vet myself, have a privileged stance in being able to both prescribe and dispense medicines. And we have received some criticism in the past from other colleagues that we haven't been approaching this with enough robustness. And we are now seeing interventions from retailers and first purchasers that are then deciding how us as a profession should be using products. A number of the supermarkets now determine which products the farmer may or may not use in their supply chain. And very much they're coming from the point of view that they're hearing the public talking about us reserving certain classes of antibiotics. And unfortunately, some of these decisions are being made at a political level without a lot of science behind it. We have the whole issue of the metaphylactic debate and understanding what that term actually means and how we should be applying, or whether we should be applying, antibiotic use in a metaphylactic situation. Some other speakers have talked about the European dimension, and we know that there are certain states in Europe that would take a different route to that one that many scientists are talking about. And we've also heard about some of the global challenges, understanding that much of our chicken, for example, is produced overseas, broiler chicken, and they may be produced under different standards dictated by that country, albeit the producers may well be dictating those standards to those producers in those areas. So the next part, the industry call to arms, the slide that hopefully I can create a bit of debate later. What should we be doing? I want my professional bodies that help us in our profession to communicate with the public that those of us that look after animals need to have medicines as part of our armoury, including antibiotics, because sick animals deserve medicines. And absolutely, as a profession, we need to be sticking to the science rather than losing ourselves always in the politics, because if we forget the science, then we will have poor foundations on which to base our arguments. I would like our farmers and our producers to be more engaged with eradicating diseases. Unfortunately, England, I certainly won't take our devolved assemblies, but England is falling a little bit behind some of the rest of Europe in our ability and our actions to eradicate a number of diseases at a national herd or flock level. As educators, whether running CPD or undergraduate training, remember that control of a disease is about a tripartite between the environment, the host and the pathogen. I get a number of my customers complain sometimes that the vets are too quick to prescribe a pharmaceutical intervention when actually a better look at the host or the environment might reduce that disease process. As pharmaceutical companies, as a practicing vet, I want to have the most up-to-date information on how to use those products that they provide me with. And data sheets that are 20, 30, 40 years old often aren't helpful if they've got the wrong dose rate on there or the wrong treatment program. They always complain that it's too expensive for them to engage with updating these data sheets. So I would like those people that are involved with that part to think about how they can reduce the cost so that we can have better science at our fingertips for those practicing vets in the field. And then for those people that are accrediting excellence, then it's very, very important that clinical governance is not based on a tick box. I'll have to slip over a couple of quick slides. Chairman's giving me the red light. So what should we be doing as vets, and what do I try and encourage in our veterinary practices? Well, certainly to follow a measure, manage, monitor approach of health planning. Vets absolutely need to re-engage with the prescription process. You know, trying an antibiotic and asking for the producer to tell you whether it's worked or not on a therapeutic trial is not acceptable. We need to engage more with diagnostics. Vets in the UK earn about 6% of their income from diagnostics. In the US, it's more than 20%. That's woeful in terms of our application of diagnostics in the sector. We should be enhancing client surveillance and data management so that we can give them better evidence-based decision-making. And we need to be educating people more as well about how we should be addressing this as an issue and understanding that we're dealing with adult learners that may be learning in a different way. I won't dwell on this, but effectively our measure, manage approach and monitor approach that we espouse within West Point is always to make sure that our decisions are evidence-based, to make sure we have that evidence. We then help the producer to manage that situation, primarily with vets, but it's very important that we engage with all the other sectors that are providing advice to the farming fraternity. And finally, if we just walk away then without monitoring whether we've succeeded in our advice, then we wouldn't be doing our job properly. So some sort of monitoring of what we do is vitally important. And so therefore a measure, manage, monitor approach, evidence-based, will help us to decide whether it's right to use an antibiotic or not, and when we should be treating, what we should be using, whether our treatment was efficacious or not. Cost effectiveness is very, very important, and we can't walk away and ignore that as part of a livestock producer's use of antibiotics on farm. Ultimately, so that we can make sure that we've used medicines appropriately and responsibly. I've got a video here which hopefully I can skip over because I'm a little bit behind time. Okay, and so we often hear the adage, as little as possible but as much as necessary. And I think that as a profession we can go a little bit further than that, because that doesn't necessarily give us a commitment to reduce our usage in the farm animal sector. And those that interpret that sometimes interpret it in a funny way. So I would much rather we follow the 3 R's approach, and any of you that are involved in research will understand the 3 R's. Based on reducing animals' usage in research, but I think those are equally could be changed to be applicable to antibiotic use in practice. Wherever possible, I think we should be looking to replace antibiotics by improving management environment or breeding on our farms. When we have to use antibiotics, can we reduce them by using them for treatment only, or could we be eradicating a disease or vaccinating against it instead? And finally, where we are using antibiotic at the same sort of volumes, can we refine the way we use it? Should we be using a different antibiotic class, dosage route, or administration? So that would certainly be our aim within a farm animal veterinary practice, and one I would espouse for the rest of the industry to follow too. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, I'm sure you'll agree, 3 excellent presentations with the regulator, and then how we might actually try and make a difference both within the companion animal sector and the agricultural sector as well. So I'm going to throw it open to the audience. We've got some roving mics. So if you want to ask a question, pose a question, hand up, and then if you could stand and say who you are and any affiliations that you will have. So who wants to kick it off? You're not trying to tell me that you're all shy. We got the mic on? Is that on? Yeah, it should be on. David?
David Chandler, I'm an AWF trustee, practicing vet, and have been a practicing vet for many years. And I'd like to ask a question of all the panellists. And as I'm old and grey, this is probably based on ignorance And I hope the question isn't quite as stupid as it sounds, because it has a lot of implications. And that is, what is prophylaxis? And before you answer, I want to give you a couple of things to think about. Is dry cow therapy prophylaxis? The other is, if you go to a bad obstetric case, pig, sheep, cow, and you give them antibiotics because they're all torn and bruised, is that prophylaxis or is it not? Over to the panel.
It's an interesting question. Who wants to... Well, dry cow therapy was mentioned, so...
I feel fairly confident in my definition of where prophylaxis, metaphylaxis and treatment sit. And I think, I know that the members of our European family sometimes struggle with where that sits. For me, prophylaxis is where we're using an antibiotic without any evidence of any infection in that particular group or cohort of animals. Where that differs from prophylaxis is where we have a group or cohort of animals that we have identified infection, not necessarily, and bacterial infection in this particular case, not necessarily in every individual animal. So therefore what we're doing is treating the infected animals, and by virtue of treating the whole group, which is very, very necessary when you're dealing with a large broiler shed or a herd of pigs, as you do, David, in your situation, where we end up treating in contact animals with those animals that are also diseased. And obviously then, for me, defined treatment is where we're treating an animal that on an individual diagnosis basis probably has been diagnosed with an infection. But one of the challenges I would put out there is that too often as vets, we're treating on a therapeutic trial basis. So we're trying antibiotics either in a metaphylactic or a treatment process without enough evidence behind our prescribing and dispensing decisions. So I feel very comfortable having antibiotics as part of my repertoire to be used in a metaphylactic situation, but I do encourage us as a profession to take diagnosis, pathogen level diagnosis, much more seriously.
So it's the use particularly, I mean, with the dry cow therapy that David mentioned, it's using it in a targeted approach, isn't it? Rather than just using it in a blanket approach. That's the difference and the nuance. And certainly we've not supported the routine, habitual sort of use of medicine in that prophylactic way.
Yes, yeah, so the 5-point plan for mastitis was fantastic, but dare I say it, that's now 50 years out of date, and blanket dry cow therapy, certainly where it pertains to antibiotic use, is probably inappropriate. Whereas I'm very, very comfortable that we use antibiotics to treat animals that have an infection, and you could also argue on a metaphylactic viewpoint that you might need to treat more animals with antibiotic because they may be at risk of getting an antibiotic infection during their dry period. But where we would fall down is where we just blanketly use the same antibiotic in every single animal in that herd when we have good tools available both in terms of data surveillance and ones where, if we're not lazy, we can obtain from diagnostic laboratories to help us to make better evidence-based decisions.
And of course, when the 5-point plan came out, we didn't have teat sealants either, or effective teat sealants, so I mean that is another alternative. Kitty, does that fit with the VMD's vision?
Yeah, I think that the definition is broadly in line with what we've discussed with colleagues in Europe. There are some definitions in a draft guideline that the EMA has produced that we've fed into, and yeah, I would agree that prophylaxis is when there's no clinically present or evident disease or infection, but as a result, we would normally expect prophylaxis to be relatively uncommon. But it's still, as Matt described, sometimes it is still necessary, and as long as it's not abused, it's the role of stewardship in making sure that every time antibiotics are used, they're used carefully and for the right reasons, and I think that's really at the heart of everything that we do when we're trying to define all these different things.
And a lot of it, I guess, is about having the conversation with the clients, isn't it? Even down on the companion side, when the dog comes in with what used to be termed kennel cough, IBD, it's having that conversation with the client to say why you're not actually having antimicrobial therapy rather than just no.
Yeah, I think in small animal practice, I agree with the definitions, but when you talk about prophylaxis and having a difficulty in determining if you're treating prophylactically or not, I think what comes into play is having that evidence base as to what you're doing. So, for example, we spoke about fevers, and someone's seeing a fever and they start with treatment, which there could be infection there, but there may not be. And so is it prophylactic or not, or is it appropriate or not? And that's where I'd like to see far more people looking at, is there infection there to start with before they start with treatment? And the other one is starting to identify whether you've just got colonization or actual infection. So sometimes we'll see evidence of bacteria on smear, but they may not be intracellular, and it may just be a colonization rather than an active infection. And then you can use other means rather than antibiotics to control that situation.
Okay, thanks. Another question? Yep. Some down the front here. Chris.
Chris Lawrence, AWF trustee. A question for Matt. Do you see a place for farm assurance schemes in the use of antibiotics?
So the question was, do I see a use of farm assurance schemes and use of antibiotics? Not simply if they're a tick box, because that doesn't deliver any benefit at all to either producer or the profession as advisors to producers out there. So where I would like any assurance scheme to go would be to be much more evidence-based. That's what clinical governance is absolutely about. So, for example, we should be asking on what the success rate is of treatment of mastitis cases. It's woeful that less than 1% of every case of mastitis in the UK do we get a pathogen level diagnosis at. It's slightly higher but in my business, but not much higher. And it's a significant challenge for us to be able to make sure that we can get to that level of information for our customers. Lots of opportunities in the future, animal side testing, pen side testing, the development of PCR, LAMP technology, all that sort of thing is coming, and I think it's inherent that us as an industry look at how we can make that sort of technology cheap enough so that the average producer on an average farm assurance can make sure that they can engage and comply. Because many producers out there don't understand some of the problems and the challenges, and they are hearing rhetoric in the press about how they're approaching problems and what they should and shouldn't be doing. And some of them are getting quite scared and concerned about the fact that they might be putting antibiotic stewardship at risk because of the way that they're using it. So I think it's inherent on us as a profession to help and guide how those programs should look in the future.
Give out another question just behind, I think. Hands going up everywhere now. So.
Chloe White, RVN. Just thinking about, obviously we're still coming out of a recession and there are still quite a lot of cost concerns, rightly or wrongly, for some pet owners. Is antimicrobial resistance such a concern that we should be considering waivering costs for things like cultures?
So, yeah, go on.
I'd say that's a difficult one to well, let me try and address that. Looking at waiving costs, if you're looking at private practice, there's always going to be a cost attached. So to look at whether one was going to have government agencies that were going to help with that, I think would be great in an ideal situation, but whether that's going to happen on the ground would be a different matter. I think you do find in terms of where we can do procedures without incurring huge costs. For example, if you want to do microscopy, which is costing you time, but it's not costing you money, and the owner can't afford that treatment, then you've got the option there to use your discretion. You can charge less or waive the cost of doing something like that. So you are still, and a lot of our vets do that, so that you are still using some evidence as to what you're using. For example, the ear smear that I used as an example, you can do your smear, you can see if there's malassezia or if there's bacteria. That doesn't cost you anything. It does cost you your time, but not in terms of money. So that sort of thing in small animal practice you can use to help. But in terms of a global sort of setting where you were going to start having subsidy for these sort of costs, I don't think I'd be able to answer that one.
Yeah, it's always a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, I was going to ask, do you get much pushback from clients while you take a swab and wait for that?
I think it's all about educating your clients. If the client can see why you're doing it, and the reason for doing it, so you just have to have a bit of time to tell them why it's good practice, then most of the time they will be able to if they can afford it, they don't mind spending the money to do it. If you're just going to go ahead and say, well, I want to do X, Y, and Z in terms of testing, but you're not explaining the procedure behind why that's important, then that's where you're going to run into resistance.
So, I mean, one of the mantras is, the correct drug for the right bug, isn't it? And unless you've done that actual testing, then you're not going to know what the bug is. How in the interim do you control sort of pain relief? You just do that with normal analgesics? Because we know that otitis, for instance, is a really painful sort of condition. And while you're waiting for the lab work to come back, obviously the infection is still florid.
I think it is a matter of your staff being educated right the way through. And what I mean by that is for example, knowing that a lot of your cystitis in your cats under the age of 10 is not going to be infectious. Very often when you are presented with a case of cystitis, you won't be able to get a urine sample because they've been going to the loo all the time. There is no urine to get. Do you then start with antibiotics presumptively and wait to get a urine sample later? No, not in a cat that's under 10. You'd use your anti-inflammatory. So you'd use an NSAID. If the problem then persisted, you'd want to have the animal back, try and get your urine sample, maybe at that stage start on antibiotics if you can see bacteria in the urine. But it is about having that information for the different procedures that you're treating as to knowing if it's likely that there's underlying infection in the first place that's causing that problem.
Yeah, Matt?
Just to add, I would suggest that we don't try and X-ray the wallets of any animal owners at all. Many animal owners there want to do the right thing. They're hearing a lot of this discussed in the media, and they absolutely want to make the right decisions, and they want the vet to be empowered to make those right decisions. And only once we start to engage with some of these technologies more will they become cheaper. So we need to be able to get our customers to invest in the health of their animals, and then us to be giving them the right evidence-based decisions to make those decisions, which will become cheaper with time.
And of course, it should also reflect the conversation they're having in their own GP practices when they visit. So it just reinforces the message in the One Health agenda.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Guy?
Yeah, just one other point I thought of there was quite often if you don't do these things properly, it actually ends up being more expensive for the client in the long run. So doing a culture on day one might save that client money because you would use the correct antibiotic if there is an infection to start with.
Okay, thanks. Kitty?
I thought I'd just pick up on the point about whether there's sort of subsidies or something like that. I mean, obviously with companion animals, it is private practice, but it's interesting to pick up on the difference that we have with the veterinary side compared with the human side, private practice versus predominantly NHS. And so I think that, I certainly wouldn't envisage that there would be any sort of government involvement in subsidising this sort of thing. We absolutely encourage it. But it is a good example of one of the difficulties we face on the veterinary side compared with the human side and getting everything together and joined up.
Thanks. More questions?
Gouda van der Berg, MSc Animal Health. A question to Kitty. Are there any plans to sort of set targets to reduce the use of antibiotics in the UK, such as happened in Holland?
No, at the moment we don't have any plans to introduce the kinds of targets that are in the Netherlands. For those of you who maybe are not familiar with what's been in place in the Netherlands, in 2009, based on the amount of antibiotics used in a way that was calculated to take account of the not just the sales of the antibiotics, but also the actual population in the countries, the Netherlands made the decision to put in a 50% reduction target over 5 years, which they've met. Now, there are two aspects which played into that. And firstly, in the Netherlands, there is the ability to measure antibiotic consumption as well as antibiotic sales. And so it's possible to target what's happening, where it's happening, and to work out if your intervention has been successful, which comes back to what I was talking about with the importance of actually making sure that your decisions and your actions are evidence-based. But it's also worth drawing out that the 50% reduction target compared with the 2009 figure, it's often brought out, but in fact in the UK at the moment, our 2009 figure, which has not dramatically changed, our levels of sales, which is what we have to measure on, are fairly steady. Our 2009 figure was in fact less than half of the Netherlands 2009 figure. All of those things tie into our thinking at the moment not to set that kind of target, and to invest all of our efforts into actually getting a system in place so that we can work out where antibiotics are going. And perhaps one of the things which is really interesting that's come out of the SVAC project, the surveillance of antibiotic consumption, is that in the piloting, the testing that's been done so far, which is on a really, really limited number of pig farms in the UK and in other member states. It's really interesting to note that even when you've got a couple of farms which are comparable in certain ways, there's a huge disparity in the actual amount of antibiotics used. So it's clear that we can't make one-size-fits-all assumptions. We need the evidence there, and if we're not going to unfairly penalise some areas. So that's quite a long answer to your question. But
it's always difficult, isn't it? If you set targets and then try and make all the strategy fit to
Absolutely.
get to the numbers, then
Absolutely.
it doesn't really address the problem, because it is a behavioural and a cultural change within the whole profession and the industry that we serve. So, and we've certainly resisted that sort of approach through FEE and our colleagues. Any more questions? Another? Peter.
Just a comment, if I may, Chairman, going back to the earlier questions on metaphylaxis, prophylaxis, treatment and so on. I think we all understand the arguments, mostly in this room, and there's not a lot of disagreement. I think the worry will be when this whole medicines regs are going through the Parliament in Brussels. And I spent the whole of the weekend before last for my sins going through the amendments proposed by the various rapporteurs in the Environmental and the Agricultural Committee for work I do at FE. And it's clear that there's a gaping misunderstanding and ignorance on behalf of the parliamentarians as to what these definitions are. I think we've won the argument sometimes with people like the European Medicines Agency, where their committee actually was totally opposed to metaphylaxis a few years ago. I think rumour can pat itself on the back that it's done a heck of a lot of good work in persuading people of the essentials of metaphylaxis, at-risk treatment of at-risk animals. But when you read what the parliamentarians are doing, they are saying things like metaphylaxis, yes, so long as the vet has examined clinically each individual animal that needs metaphylactic treatment. And so I would recommend anybody that is here today, if you belong to organisations where you have the ability to lobby, to persuade, either at UK or European level, to just have a look at some of this stuff, not waste the whole weekend, but just really look at this stuff and start getting your act together, because seriously, there is a real threat as this stuff goes through the European Parliament that we will have constraints imposed upon us that will change the use of antibiotic therapy irrationally for years to come.
Yeah, well said, Peter. I mean, we have to have the definitions consistent between the various professions if we're really going to get anywhere with this. I know that you've done a lot of work on that. Just behind, over in the middle. Sorry to point.
Joanna Bradley, First Opinion, Small Animal Practice. This is mainly a question for Guy. I really support your ideas of, the smear followed by treatment if it's indicated. But do you have a protocol for cases where it's more difficult to sample, such as kennel cough? And do you have protocols in place for your vets?
We do have protocols in place. We've got a clinical committee that's made up of experienced practicing veterinarians, and they get together and form these protocols. I myself am not actually on that committee because I'm doing more management now. I did run one of our 24-hour hospitals for over 20 years, but I've been moving out over the last year or so. But what I would say is that where possible, we do try and evidence what we're doing. Something like kennel cough, I think, is a more tricky one, and personally, I think that would boil down to experience. I would use tetracycline or an antibiotic if an animal came in that I suspect of having kennel cough. As you say, I'm not quite sure what one can do if you can't get these samples easily. You do have to fall back on experience, and you will have protocols in place that'll give you guidance on that, and things like the Protect post are really useful for that as well. Not just do I use antibiotics, but if I'm going to, which antibiotic am I going to use? But yeah, if you can't get a sample, then there's not much you can do about evidence.
Harvey Locke. I'd like to commend Guy for the protocols that they put in place in their practice. It's very good. But my observation of going around the country, practices that are in the practice standards scheme, is that yes, they will have their antibiotic protocol use. They will have their protect poster up. But then you look at the clinical records, and all too often they're reaching first time for fluoroquinolones and third and fourth generation cephalosporin. So my impression is that the message is still not getting through, certainly in companion animal practice. Question for Kitty, really. Do you think one way we could get this message through is to adopt the Australian approach where you make the reporting of these critical antimicrobials compulsory to the regulator?
Well, there are a lot of things that could be done. I mean, one of the things that we have running really through everything that we do at the VMD is, well, the last government certainly was not keen on increasing the regulatory burden across the board, and there's no sign that this is going to change. It's not something that we're looking at the moment, but I think what we really want to do at the VMD, what we've been doing is running engagement for and trying to speak to people and trying to get people on board. And our ethos really is to try and get a change to come from within, because perhaps, you know, in the same way as in trying to get people to make changes in Medivet, as Guy was describing, it's much more effective if you can actually get people to work together and mean it, rather than to have a top-down approach that penalises people. I guess it's the kind of thing that it's useful to see what other people are doing, and it's useful to learn when we see whether or not interventions have worked. But our preference is not to take that kind of top-down approach if we can help it.
Okay, we're going to take one more question there. And then...
Hello, this is mainly for Matt. My name's Jenny Stavisky. I'm from the University of Nottingham. It's maybe a question without an answer, for which I apologise. But as I used to be a farm vet, and my question to you is really, given that many of the diseases that we're talking about, so mastitis and lameness, are primarily diseases of this relentless increase in production and metabolic stress, is there an argument that as a profession we should be seeking to de-escalate the intensification rather than legitimise it and make it easier by treating these diseases when they occur?
Yeah, so I think we need to think carefully about our position on intensification. We do have a duty to obviously feed our population. The government will want to keep the price of food low, it's a big driver in inflation, and you know, we're set to see a 70% increase in protein production around the world over the next 40 years, primarily coming from anything that's white, poultry, fish, pig or milk. And so, you know, this increase in production, and it will become more intensive, especially when China and India come on board. They don't have the land mass, for example, to be able to follow some extensive production processes. So we will have to engage with intensive production in some way. And intensive production per se is not bad as long as you properly invest. You know, my comment earlier was a disease process, a bacterial disease process is always a tripartite. You've got the impacts on the host, you've got the environment, as well as the pathogen. And I think, unfortunately, you know, we don't spend enough time as a profession looking at how we should be interacting with the host and the environment, how we should be educating our animal owners on how they should be keeping their animals, and often too quick we jump to the treatment option, of which is very, very easy to go and reach for the medication. So I think, you know, as a profession, you know, certainly having spent time abroad in more intensive production systems in the Middle East and in the US, the impact of the host and the environment plays a much bigger part of a role of what the vet does. And so that really requires us as a profession to engage with our customer in a little bit of a different way, and they need to be willing, for example, to accept payment for our time and not for us to be making such big margins on our provision of medicines.
I think it's a huge issue, isn't it? And
yep.
You know, intensification, you know, there are tensions both with welfare, with drug use across the piece, but we need to get away from this sort of behaviour that disease is a normal part of the production cycle, because quite clearly it isn't.
Yep.
So, good. Well, I mean, that was an absolutely cracking debate, and I think, you know, we really explored some issues, but in the interests of moving things along for time and me not getting told off by Florence, I'm going to draw it to a conclusion. So if you could please show your appreciation for the